It's February 2026. Russia's war against Ukraine is in its fourth year, and today we'll take another look at the military situation. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is Build Situation Room. And we start in the southern Ukrainian region of Zaporizhzhia, back in Zaporizhzhia, where most of the fighting is now taking place between Russian invaders and Ukrainian defenders. That is why we also have a whole series of videos that show us the battle both on the ground as well as in the air, and we want to go through them one by one. To start with, we are going to take a look at a new video from the Russian army, which is showing us the alleged capture of the village of Zalesnichne. Zalesnichne is a strategically important place because we see both a large factory and a railway line running right through this location. First off, we see these typical Russian videos of the massive attacks on civilian infrastructure in Zalesnichne. So we see drone strikes, but we're also seeing multiple rocket launches being used, aerial bombs, glide bombs being used against the various positions. And we see over time throughout the video what the videos from likely the last 2 months show. More and more of those houses there are being destroyed where people were still living, and we see that most of them have already lost their roofs. We also see the different weather, so sometimes there's snow, sometimes no snow. This just shows us that the Russians have basically put together a best of, if you will, of their devastating attacks on the city here. We also see that various kamikaze drones are being used here, which are being fired at the residential buildings there. We see quadcopters in some cases, and we just saw that quite well. Here we see it once again. So these are basically the fixed-wing drones that fly right past the observation drones, basically, and then dive right into the respective houses here. According to Russian reports, this has led to, and we'll see that shortly, the town meanwhile being abandoned by the Ukrainians, that they have withdrawn, and that the Russian army has now moved in here in Zalesnichne. We are now about to see the video footage of that as well, which show us that the Russians, once again in various locations within the city, are flying their flags, basically showing over and over, yeah, we're here, and then also those typical zooms in and out, now that we're seeing more attacks on logistics here right around the city. However, and we should in fact must mention, Ukraine denies all of it. Once again, we have the situation, now we see it here, the flags being waved. Once again, we have the situation where the Russians say we have Zalesnichne under control. By the way, now we also see the relatively large scale of the city, which we'll see even better in a moment. And the Ukrainians say, no, those were just very small units that were in there for a short while, raised up their flags, and then basically ended up running away once again. And here we can see the railway line quite clearly, which runs all the way through the entire town there. We'll see right up there, and we'll also see the Russian soldiers, the larger factories here in the northern part of town. And we see exactly why this small town in the end had only about 1,200 residents living there, but it's still quite important, at least as a logistics hub, it's quite important. Here, as I said, is the industrial zone, and over there, it's actually quite striking. We see the Russian troops here who are behaving very deliberately, or maybe just putting on a relaxed act. They're dancing around here a bit, they're celebrating the whole thing, waving several flags around. However, looking at that right now, 4 Russian soldiers, then it's also either an extremely dangerous game the Russians are playing here. So basically putting 4 soldiers right in a position where they can easily be attacked by drones. Or maybe it really is the case that the Russian army has actually captured this location and that Ukraine simply doesn't have any soldiers left in Zalesnichne right now and is therefore just arguing for the time being, we are still there. Although they are actually not there right now, but would instead have to eventually proceed to recapture it. It also recaptured another place a bit further north, Tarnuwate, and this one had 2 small suburbs. The first one has already been freed, the second one now here as well, as we can see in this footage, the 33rd separate brigade. This is actually footage from Kosivzeve. We'll take a look at it on the map in a moment to see where these different locations are that the Russians claim to have captured and Ukraine claims to have liberated. We can see once again quite clearly in this footage the difference between the thermal view on the left and the normal view on the right. And we see it's the same scene throughout. Ukrainian soldiers trying to storm a house where Russians were still hiding at the time. Other houses are being blown up, some of them being attacked by drones, others also with explosive packages, in order to drive out the Russians and to regain full control over this small village of Kosivzeve right here. And it's really back and forth, as I said, more details on the map in a moment, back and forth, what's happening right now. The Ukrainians trying to push the Russians back, the Russians trying to push further forward. And we currently have little official information, but there's a lot being said on the Ukrainian side. A military spokesperson has come forward and said, we can't reveal anything right now. We have operations here, we're trying to change the situation at the front, but what the Russian war bloggers are claiming, that pretty much corresponds to reality. And these Russian war bloggers have been spreading some really dire news here over the last few days regarding the situation in this part of the front, specifically around Hulja Pole. We are now also taking a look at the current situation on the map. We have just seen the video footage from one of those in Zalisnichne. We can see it quite well right here now. Exactly, Zalisnichne here in the south of the front. Visible right down here on the map, a fairly large town. We had also already drawn in the railway line over the last few days. It runs roughly along here from town to town. Ternuvate was liberated by the Ukrainians, and we've just seen the footage here from Kosivzeve, and Kosivzeve was supposedly by now also under Ukrainian control. Russian war bloggers say that Dobropilya has also since been retaken by the Ukrainians. However, we don't have any visual evidence for that just yet, and as I said, the Ukrainians are keeping a bit quiet and are trying to explain that they're making an effort here to change the situation, but that they can't officially announce anything just yet. And we see down here Huliepol a bit further on the map here in the east, and we'll see in a moment that the Ukrainian army is also doing a lot to target the Russian supplies currently gathering in Huliepol. That means from there they are trying to push westward to attack those supplies. We have new footage from the Ukrainian Air Force where you can see how a Soviet-built MiG-29 is dropping French-made AASM 250 glide bombs which were supplied to Ukraine, and now we're seeing these glide bombs about to impact right in the center of Huliepol. You see it right there marked by the Ukrainians, and it's also interesting to see the glide bomb hit the house first. I don't know if I can catch it at the right moment. We'll see if that works. So that you basically see the impact first. There we saw it. So there's the first explosion, we see it here, and here is the impact of the bomb. And now it takes a few seconds before the bomb then explodes further down in the house itself. So now we see it here, the big explosion, and supposedly the Russian soldiers who were hit and killed in this residential building here as a result. As said, this geolocated footage is simple. Behind it we see the sports field, soccer pitch, and the former small stadium of Huliepol. And so we can say pretty accurately where the Russians have dug in here, namely in this town, formerly with, I think, 5,600 people, a relatively small town, but now under Russian control. We also see further footage of attacks, also all from these MiG-29s and also from AASM 250 bombs. This time Stepnohersky is under attack. These are all shots from Zaporizhzhia as well. And the next footage is also meant to show individual attacks on villages that were occupied by the Russians in Stepnohersky or in Zaporizhzhia over the last few months. So we see there's really a multitude of videos right now showing us what's happening here, that there is indeed fighting, that the Russians expanded their offensive from Donetsk to Zaporizhzhia. And you have to at least say both oblasts were already annexed by Vladimir Putin in the fall of 2022. However, Russia still doesn't have full control in both oblasts. We are also looking at some additional footage from near Stepnohersk, which we have just seen. Here we see special forces of the Ukrainian army as they move near this town, specifically in the small town of Lukyanivske. Lukyanivske, as I said, one of several villages that are just nearby. And once again, the Russians have tried to carry out a flanking maneuver here. They couldn't take Stepnohersk directly. The center is still under Ukrainian control. And that's why they went around the outside trying to capture small villages to the north and pushing the Ukrainians here with assault units, with special forces who are trying to push the Russians back and accordingly bring this small place, namely Lukyanivsky here, back under control. We can also see various explosive devices used by the Ukrainians. Basically, we just saw it, the small explosion. That means they're really trying to move in with small teams here. The Russians are mostly out in teams of 2, 3, or maybe 5 to attack here in the region, trying to bring this village back under their control once again. And we've also got a video of the end coming up showing us, we just saw right there how that explosive device was thrown in. Now we're seeing the explosion. A video showing us how Lukyanivsky is allegedly back under Ukrainian control. The whole thing was also geolocated, actually taking place on the edge of the village. But we're seeing this back and forth, not just in the Huliepol region, but also in the Stepnohersk region, which is about 70-80 kilometers further west. That means we actually have massive fighting here along the Zaporizhzhia front, where both sides are trying to gain ground or respectively defend their own country. And during the Ukrainian counter-thrust, or these various counter-thrusts we're seeing right now, there are also many Russians who simply don't want to fight anymore, who want to surrender. 2 of them were filmed in the region, also Zaporizhzhia. And here we see the truly awful fate one of these Russians faces because the Russian army simply won't allow it. They do everything they can to stop their own soldiers from surrendering. If necessary, they're even killed accordingly before they become Ukrainian prisoners of war. We have two soldiers here moving along a snowy road, apparently both unarmed and wounded, heading toward the Ukrainians. Down there's the first, up there's the second. Soon we'll see truly shocking footage, which we must pixelate. Specifically, the Russian army is attacking these surrendering soldiers with their own drones, trying to kill them before they reach the Ukrainian lines, and then for at least a few months simply won't be able to fight anymore before they're usually swapped for Ukrainian prisoners of war. So here is that situation again. Both soldiers surrender to the drone, knowing what's ahead. And now we see the thermal view of both of them here. We have already seen the one in front, the one behind, and now the Ukrainians are trying to pull it up a little bit higher. You can see it here, this small bright spot, this bright dot. That's the drone, that's the Russian drone, approaching the Russian soldier from behind. We have to pixelate this whole part at that moment, of course, and it basically ensures that he dies before he reaches the lines. Now we also see the other one turning around. We also have to pixelate all of that now, basically what the Russians made out of it. That means they are actually trying to prevent their own soldiers from surrendering in order to minimize the entire pool of potential prisoners of war for an exchange. The second soldier now reaches the Ukrainian lines here and then enters Ukrainian captivity there accordingly. And not just with planes, as we've just seen, but also with drones, of course. Ukraine is trying to attack Russia further behind the front lines. We are still in the Zaporizhzhia region, and right now we are seeing the attack on a BM-27 Uragan multiple rocket launcher using several, or vampire drones each. This means that they are hexacopters which are being used to drop their bombs far behind the actual front lines. We see the Uragan with a fairly long range of several dozen kilometers. However, the Ukrainians are also able, here 25 kilometers south of the front, to take action against the Russians. We have both, as we just saw, we have both bomber drones and kamikaze drones, which are being used here in order to keep destroying this Russian vehicle more and more. And here we see it quite clearly. Up there, that's the bomber basically circling. Down there now, the BM-27, already on fire, with a modernized chassis, by the way, with only 3 axles. Exactly, instead of the 4 you'd usually see. Regardless, the Russians are coming under heavy fire here, and in the end we see this rocket launcher being completely destroyed. It's always good to see these two perspectives. We have a reconnaissance drone, we have a bomber drone, and we also just had a drone watching the whole thing from very close range, presumably at least a kamikaze drone. I'm not actually quite sure about that. And in the end we even see how the drone lands nearby and takes a look, checking out exactly what has been hit, where you might still need to drop more explosives, and where this BM-27 is simply no longer operational. All this just shows us that the Ukrainians are trying to destroy Russian assets before they can be deployed, or at least while they're in use. That means as soon as the Russian army approaches the front with these medium-range weapons, they're attacked by Ukrainian drones. And let's take another look at the map to understand what's going on overall here in Zaporizhzhia. We'll go back into the region briefly, then zoom out a bit more in order to locate all of these videos we just watched to see where the Russians are trying to push further forward and where the Ukrainians are holding their ground with everything they've got. Just to clarify the situation, on the left side here we have Stepnohorsk, a town where the center is still held by Ukraine, but the rest is not. We had the video from Lukyanivske, which was right about here, meaning the Russians tried to bypass Stepnohorsk there, but were then stopped by the Ukrainians. We've seen that the Russian invasion army of Putin advanced near Hulyapol, specifically at Salisnichne, as we can see over here, but that the Ukrainians right up here near Ternuvate have also recaptured the suburb of Kosivtseve. And the attack that we just saw on this BM-27 took place way down here, specifically near Vasilyevka, a small village 25 kilometers behind the front, as I mentioned. And we have indeed also seen, I believe that it was quite clear, how these MiG-29s attacked both in Huljapol and in the Russian-occupied parts of Stepnohorsk. This means we're really seeing both sides putting in a lot of effort here. We've seen it from the Russian side as well. Of course, glide bombs being used. Really putting in a lot of effort from mechanized infantry as well as drone units and the Air Force to show as much commitment as possible in Zaporizhzhia to either defend this region or to conquer it illegally. From Zaporizhzhia, we move on to Donetsk in the east of the country, where we have new footage from near Pokrovsk, showing us once again that quite large Russian units are now gathering there to launch an attack northwards from Pokrovsk. Here, for once, we have to watch this with the logo on screen because we can already see the approach. And here we see the drone while it is attacking a relatively large Russian group. That is a total of 3 vehicles and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or so Russian soldiers just moving around right there and are now trying to get away from that spot where the Ukrainian drone is attacking. All in all, we see that some soldiers managed to get to safety, are now being attacked, and soon, for reasons that we do not quite understand, there is a second attack once again on this very group. This is the same spot we just saw. The soldiers were right about here, the Russians. Now they're there, all gathering around the vehicle. Maybe they wanted to repair it or they wanted to hear something. It's not quite clear. Anyway, once again, we see a relatively small group now, only 3 Russian soldiers who are also being attacked, however. And we see right here, the Russians have massed thousands of men in Pokrovsk, this very city of 65,000 inhabitants, and they're trying to attack from there to the north, to the west, to push the Ukrainians further back. The footage we just saw came from here in the northwestern part of Pokrovsk, just before Hryshyn. That's where the Russians have gathered. However, we know, and we can also see it here in the orange area, that the Russians are trying to bypass Rodinske and push forward here towards Dobropilya and Biletske. So these are areas that were actually briefly under Russian control last summer. Then, as we can see from the blue color, were recaptured. However, now the Russians are slowly pushing forward again, as I said, moving past Rodinske, and we see it up here. Toretsk is already partly occupied. This means that Zoloty Kolodyas, where the Russian army gained a foothold last year, is now once again under a very serious threat of being captured from here during a second offensive in the same direction. From Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, we move to Sumy in the far northeast of Ukraine. There is a new video out of there showing us that the Russians have actually now, who would have expected it, started to carry out attacks with snow scooters, meaning they are riding snowmobiles right along the front, or rather driving deep into enemy territory. Another attack which ends in a disaster here, though. We see it quite well here. 2 Russian army snowmobiles, both fully packed with soldiers, and behind them, in each case, we can see those trailers. They're towing even better now. That means they're trying to take the equipment as far as possible, given the current snow conditions here. But you can also see that as soon as the vehicles arrived, during the forest battles that were just attacked here near Nowy Sich, a small village, we'll see it on the map in a moment. They're being attacked by Ukraine and are being heavily decimated right there. We see that Ukraine is using various weapons. Likely mortars are involved, possibly artillery as well, and drones time and again. We have to blur out a large part of this because we see truly overwhelming firepower from the Ukrainians meeting the Russians here, who have no chance at all to establish themselves at all. We have the information. Now we see it again, by the way, what I wanted to show earlier. That we see here. So that's one snowmobile, and here in front is the other snowmobile, which is already burning. And in between we see these trailers, which basically carried the ammunition or something similar in order to advance as far as possible and then maybe secure food or something like that there. We have the situation where Ukraine says they killed 4 or 5 of the invaders instantly, and the others, will actually see it in the footage in a moment, then surrendered accordingly and were taken as Ukrainian prisoners of war. There are up to 11 soldiers, you'll see there in a moment, basically lining up in a nice neat row and then being led away by the Ukrainians. Right here you can see the moment of the Russian surrender where they finally just say that there is simply no point in it anymore and they stop fighting. And here we see it, a larger group of Russian soldiers moving along here and now basically surrendering themselves to the Ukrainians. Some individual Russian soldiers followed on later who had been hit elsewhere and came from other areas in this region, but as we see here, they also ended up surrendering individually as well. So this was another attempt to push forward here. We'll see it on the map in a moment. They advanced quite far beyond the occupied territory, but were then completely stopped and taken prisoner. This naturally also shows us a lot about the motivation of the Russian soldiers, who are simply forced in part to advance from one point to another somewhere, and then just don't really feel like it to put up any resistance once they've arrived there. At least in this specific case, that's how it was, and we rarely see 11 soldiers being taken prisoner. Yeah, a pretty rare recording. Nowy Sich, we see it down here in an area that was already under Russian control in 2022, hence these blue stripes. Now, however, we see it here roughly, what's that, 5 to 6 kilometers away from Yanukivka, the nearest Russian-controlled village. That means the Russians tried to push very far forward with these snowmobiles, but were then stopped accordingly by the Ukrainian army here in the Sumy region. We're staying in Sumy for a moment to look at a Russian attack from February 5th. So a few days ago, specifically an attack on a locomotive and a train depot that was carried out here. And at first we only had the photos, so we had the photos from the Ukrainians of what it all looked like, but now we've also received the footage of the attack from the Russians. Traditionally, the Russians are proud of attacking civilian targets like this train here. The city is called Voronezh, not to be compared or confused with Voronezh on the Russian side, Voronezh, which is a small town in Sumy that was attacked right here. And we see smoke and various explosions over here too. And these are the Ukrainian photos we had before. The attack on the railway, which we just saw, but also on the railway operating infrastructure, which were attacked there in order to bring train traffic to a standstill here in Sumy and to deliver another blow. We see it here too, a civilian rail car, just a normal passenger car. Everything just to strike a blow against the Ukrainian railway, which is of course the backbone of more than just transport in Ukraine, as no planes can fly in the country anymore because of the Russian aggression. But of course it also naturally helps in getting Ukrainian soldiers to the front lines. All this, as I said, is no justification, but simply an explanation why the Russians want to stop this rail line, to paralyze people all across the country so they can no longer move from A to B. How is Ukraine reacting to all this? They launched a new long-range attack of their own this morning, targeting Ukhta, a city in central Russia, relatively far in the north of Russia, 1,800 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. And we see here some footage of the attack. Here we see it. These are AN-196 Luty drones deployed by the Ukrainian side. Long-range drones, basically, that flew way past Moscow and then continued 3 times that distance on the other side, on the northeastern side of Moscow. And then they ended up striking right here in the Ukhta refinery. We can see the massive fire that has broken out right there in this refinery, just next to the power plant here on the right side. Probably oil or gas then being burnt there accordingly. That means the Ukrainians are still trying to carry out at least some pinpricks, strategic strikes deep inside Russia to at least counter this massive terror. We still know, even now, there isn't 24-hour power for any single Ukrainian at all. That means all 39 million. The Ukrainians have these emergency shutdowns that basically turn the power on and off every few hours. And heating is also very limited. Ukraine is trying to counter this terror with targeted strikes against critical Russian infrastructure.